All right, everybody, welcome back. We have MacGyvered our way out of the problems as we usually do. And we're now ready to go into the presentation from Simone from Berlin in Germany. Simone, I'm going to give the floor to you right away. Go ahead and amaze us with some scientific knowledge bombs.
Okay, I'm Simone. Nice to be here in a way. I do neuroscience and I'm interested in video gaming and how that may affect the brain. So let me walk you through a few slides, and I would like to see the next slide. On the left side, you see what scientists have used in order to train rodents, namely rats. So they use an environment like, for example, on the left, which just looks like a big garbage can in a way, but having more stimulation seems to help rats to grow their brain. And that you can see on the right side, where we have an image of the hippocampus in a control rat that is living in a standard cage. And on the bottom, you see the rat living in that sort of nice environment with enriched factors. There you see that they have more neurons and more sort of branches and axons in the brain. That means by the environment that we put ourselves in, we can grow our brain, which is interesting. In humans, and now the next slide, please. We cannot so easily look at single neurons. So what we do is we use magnetic resonance imaging. As you see here on the left, that's the machine. We put the head of the subject into a so-called coil so that we can measure the brain. Unfortunately, you can't see the brain scan on the right side now, but you can nicely image gray and white matter within the structure of the human brain. Now to the next slide, please. And since we can do this in humans, what has been done is that taxi drivers and bus drivers have been compared. And what they found is that taxi drivers tend to have a bigger hippocampus in itself. So these yellow blobs here indicate that taxi drivers have more volume there compared to bus drivers in London, which has been interpreted as an effect of training. So meaning if you learn to drive a taxi, you need to know the city well, more than a bus driver, which grows your brain. Next slide, please. And then we did a study in our institute where we wanted to train this ability to become a taxi driver, let's say. So what we did is we used a 3D environment. Actually, that was one taken out of the video game Quake. And what we did is we placed animals at certain points and asked subjects to remember where these animals are in that new environment. And we were able to show that people train this ability, so they get better at performance, as you can see in the middle plot. And at the same time, the hippocampus ages less severely. So we can basically train the hippocampus by playing a sort of 3D video game in a sense. And now to the next slide, please. And then, since this worked so well in that artificial environment, which is clearly not a video game and very boring for the subjects, what we did is we asked adults how much video games they are playing, or they have been playing during their entire lifetime, and have looked at, is this correlated to any particular region in the brain? And what we found is that the more adults played video games during their lifetime, the bigger their so-called entorhinal cortex was, the areas here marked in red on both sides of the brain. And that's particularly interesting since the entorhinal cortex is involved in coding where in space you are located. So basically, if you sort of retrieve, I'm next to the tree and the table or whatever, these areas actually code where you are in space. And interestingly, this volume in that region was associated with playing, in particular, platformer games, as well as puzzle and logic games. So having played these games, particularly, let these brain regions potentially grow, or we aren't sure yet, to be honest. On the right side, what you see here is video gaming in 14-year-old children. And what we've seen there is that the current hours that they are playing, so we asked them, how much do you game right now? That was associated with what we call cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, which is really, really surprising because the prefrontal cortex is usually involved in strategic planning, in learning mathematics, in updating memories in the brain. So really in all these positive school-like abilities. And actually now these 14-year-olds show the more they've been gaming, the bigger that brain area is. So for us, that was really interesting. And in no of these analyses, we found any negative effects of gaming. However, these results cannot be taken causally. So we don't know what the hen or the egg is. So what was there first? Were these brain regions bigger before and therefore people liked playing video games? Or have playing video games really caused the brain areas to grow? And in order to find this out, and I would like to move to the next slide if possible, we trained naive subjects, so people who usually do not play video games, in Super Mario 64. You might find that funny, but people who do not play video games can at least play Super Mario. And it would be, I think, a long way to go to StarCraft. So what we've done is we looked at their brain before 2 months of training and after 2 months of training, and have looked at what brain areas changed due to that training intervention in comparison to a control group that did not train. And surprisingly, we found that and that's depicted on the right side, the hippocampus grows in those who train Super Mario, as well as the prefrontal cortex and what we call the cerebellum. It's again the two regions, hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, that I've talked about before, involved in spatial navigation in a sense and in strategic planning, that seem to be growing in size due to video gaming. And if we move to the next slide, you can also nicely see that the more people said they liked playing the game, so the more they sort of had the desire to play the game, the bigger their brain grew, which nicely shows that actually being engaged in a task and loving to play games can be a promoter for brain plasticity, which I think is totally thrilling, because that means we have to find things that people like doing because they learn better from it. And on the right side, you can unfortunately not see the video right now, but what we did is we tested people before and after training with the video game, how they navigate in space. And actually they learn to navigate better in space due to playing Super Mario. All right, and to the next slide. Why do I like video games so much in training? That is because they are intrinsically motivating. So you don't need to pay people massive amounts of money to actually train, but they like doing this. On the other hand, it has been in other literature shown that with training with video games leads to wide transfer effects. Transfer effects are effects that you train, let's say StarCraft, and you actually see that people get better in whatever other thing, be it something at school, be it something at work. So, and that's something seldomly seen, that people can use a skill they have acquired in a training regime outside of that training regime. And that's particularly easy to achieve with video games. And the last point is, video gaming seems to elicit striatal dopamine release. You've probably always heard of dopamine as the sort of happiness transmitter. And that seems to be related in turn to brain plasticity. So gaming makes people happy, and that in turn leads to brain plasticity. All right, and to the next slide. And this does not only happen if you use commercial video games. So we've used Super Mario, but we've also lately tried to design a game specifically to train older adults. So we recruited people above the age of 65 years, and we wanted to train them in what we call response inhibition. You probably all know this. You are about to make an action, and then you stop it in the very last moment because you decide otherwise. And that's an action being led by the so-called right inferior frontal gyrus, the area that you see here on the left bottom. And usually we psychologists tend to test this by showing people lots of axes to which they have to respond, and then seldomly presenting some case in between to which they are not to respond. So this is how we train doing and not doing something, yeah? Very dumbly, let's say. And let's go to the next slide. I thought we can have more fun by doing something like the game Fruit Ninja, which is just about the same. Every fruit that comes along needs to be sliced, except these bombs, because whenever they occur, you're not to touch them. So it's the same principle. I then talked to game designers, and they said with older people, you can't have them destroy food. I mean, they'll hate it. So what we did is we had this game on the right that we programmed, which was involving a Mediterranean cruise, and you actually saw where your ship was depending on your performance, and the actual task was collecting food items to your plate. So you had to swipe from the top and collect basically everything except a few things that were depicted on the napkin, essentially. So, and people loved it. I mean, these above 65s, they loved doing it. They trained for 2 months. And then if you go to the next slide, we actually saw that this brain area demarcated here in yellow, which is the right inferior frontal gyrus that is responsible for response inhibition, actually grew in this green group that trained with this game. And we didn't find this in the other groups, namely a passive control group that did nothing, and neither in a group that did these typical Dr. Kawashima-like training modules that are supposed to be good. So my take on this is that actually playing a real game that is designed as a game and is rewarding and everything in nature is the best way to train even specific skills as response inhibition seen here. And on the right side, you nicely see that the more people trained, so the more time they spend with the game, the bigger the cortex got. So essentially that means the more people played, the more it did their brain good in a way. And please to the next slide. And here is something that I found in the literature where people have tested StarCraft professionals. Unfortunately, only 23 in number. And I think you should better compare people who do not play StarCraft with those who do play StarCraft instead. But what they've done here is they correlated the career length with cortical thickness in the brain, and again also found particular regions being positively associated with the length of the career. So actually we can summarize that you're training your brain while playing StarCraft, which I think is nice. And that's basically the end of my presentation. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to thank you and would say enjoy gaming and open to questions.
Right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, there we go. Thank you very much, Simone. I love the presentation, and of course I was very you can see me now too in about 30 seconds. I loved hearing you talk about a kind of like a positive approach of investigating gaming effects on the brain. I've got just a few quick questions. So basically, like I am just I'm an uninformed member of the audience, right? And what I've just heard is, so as long as I play fun games, I'll have good grades in school, right? So as long as the game is fun, it makes me learn a lot. That will be pretty unnuanced, I think. So you already talked about saying that you don't know how the causation goes. But do you have like an underlying assumption that you're working from that maybe gaming has a positive influence, or would you say you yourself are really not sure what's going on there? There's change, but you don't know what happens.
I'm pretty positive that the change generally seems to be positive. I've now been doing 3 different studies in which we train people, and we haven't seen any decreases so far. I mean, it doesn't mean that more brain is necessarily really helpful, right? I mean, it can grow and you don't know, is it water? What is it really that grows? On the other hand, we've never seen any negative impact, namely less structure due to gaming. Although I have to admit, we have done it in normal ranges. I mean, these people have played maybe up to an hour a day or so. So we haven't done anything where we had people play 9-10 hours a day, which I think could be harmful already, and I have no clue about this. So we've done it in a normal, healthy range, I'd say. And there it seems to do good.
All right, pretty cool. And so did you just present the first results of the study done with StarCraft?
No, the last thing isn't my study. That's data from people from Japan, I think. Okay,
because the only thing we are really interested to hear is that StarCraft is better for your brain than League of Legends, but I don't know if you can do any any predictions about that yet. But No, but so what I wanted to ask basically, do you think there's specific, of course you've already talked about this, but specific skills that are being trained with specific games? For example, so what would you train if you played StarCraft? It wouldn't be spatial recognition probably, but what would it be?
My hunch is it would be speed in particular, because you have to be pretty fast. And the other thing would also be prefrontal cortex, because you're strategically planning ahead. I mean, you really need to monitor lots of things. And we have something that we would call dual tasking, that you have like multiple tasks that you need to do at the same time. And that is also something being achieved by prefrontal cortex. So that would be my prediction.
Cool, thank you. I got a final question. So we've heard a lot of negative reporting on the effects of gaming in the media and from science as well, like you told me a couple of weeks ago. So there's been a large negative, storming vibe surrounding gaming and research. Could you say, maybe, do you think that you may be on the forefront of a new positive wave of research into gaming, or a more, dare I say, neutral or objective look at what gaming does with your brain?
Yes, I do think so, because and it's not only me. There are by now several people engaging into actually objectively looking at what can we use video games for. And I think the rest of the science that has been done, also looking into does video gaming make people more aggressive, has been heavily biased. I mean, they've been having people play, say, Call of Duty for an hour, and then have looked at whether they can remember aggressive words better. And they have sort of then concluded, since you can remember aggressive words better after having played for an hour directly before, which is clear, which would every person would show that effect, that this means people get more aggressive on a long-term basis in action, which is ridiculous. I mean, there's no way. I mean, we are now currently doing a longitudinal study training people in Grand Theft Auto in order to see whether that has long-term effects. Although I think the science has been greatly biased in wanting to show it makes people aggressive, and it has a bad impact.
Thank you very much. I'm very enthusiastic about your outlook on the way this science should be done. If we can ever be of any service, maybe provide a couple of StarCraft pros for you to experiment on, just let us know. And for now, we just want to thank you a lot for your presentation. Thank you very much. And for the people in the audience here, stay tuned for the people on stream, because we're going to be back really soon with Group B, featuring Guru versus Optimus first. Goody, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it. His car broke down. So it's going to be Guru versus Optimus first, and then Red versus Space Marine for Group B. Simone, again, thank you very much. To everybody else, see you in just a little bit.
Good luck.
Thank you.